On a night of pouring rain, a woman said goodbye to her husband and got out of the car. After that, she was engrossed in a phone call and paid no attention to her surroundings. Right at this moment, a car suddenly sped straight towards her. The powerful impact took the woman's life on the spot. Shortly after, the police received a report. They immediately arrived to cordon off the scene. Just then, Tu Hieu happened to be driving past. Seeing a commotion, he got out of his car to investigate. There was no dash cam in the vehicle that caused the accident. However, Tu Hieu found a family photograph of the victim within the police cordon. Meanwhile, the victim's husband was crying bitterly. He appeared absolutely devastated by his wife's passing. Tu Hieu picked up the photograph to take a look. He noticed the man in the photo looked different from the driver involved in the crash, so he approached to ask a few questions. The driver claimed that he was drunk. Nevertheless, he answered the police's questions very fluently. Tu Hieu crouched down to inspect the victim's handbag. He found 3 condoms inside and instantly felt that something was amiss. Tu Hieu recalled the husband's sorrowful expression from earlier and realized the man was faking his tears. From this, Tu Hieu deduced that this was no ordinary drink-driving accident. At that moment, Tu Hieu received a phone call. He had to take on another criminal case. He rushed to the scene and learned it was a dismemberment murder. The Criminal Investigation Department quickly convened to analyze the case. The police set up a special task force, and Tu Hieu was appointed as the team leader. He surmised that the crime scene was situated in a desolate area. A young woman couldn't possibly live in such an isolated place. This proved that the murder scene was far away from the dumping site, a factor that significantly compounded the difficulty of the investigation. The following day, Tu Hieu woke up late because he had taken sleeping pills the night before, making him late for work. His team's old office was far too cramped, and the newly formed special task force required a more spacious room. Therefore, they were granted special permission to relocate to a larger office. Just then, an old classmate named Cao Ban rang Tu Hieu to inform him that his deduction was entirely correct. The driver from the accident had terminal cancer and was incurable. The woman who was run over was actually the wife of the 4 drivers' attending physician. She had been having an affair, but adamantly refused to grant a divorce, wanting to repay the doctor's kindness, and with the addition of 500,000 renminbi given by Director Hao, the driver agreed to help him murder his wife. Teo Ting went to the archives to review missing persons files. The records clerk, named Kwok Kwong, was highly proficient at locating files. He then asked Teo Tin about the progress of the case. When Kwok Kwong looked at the photograph Teo Tin handed him, he recalled a case he had encountered in his youth that bore a striking resemblance to the current one. Kwok Kwong immediately hurried to find Tu Hieu. Tu Hieu held Kwok Kwong in high regard. As the older man had once been awarded a second-class medal, Kwok Kwong bluntly asked Tu Hieu about the case. Tu Hieu promptly reprimanded Teo Tin for leaking internal information. However, Kwok Kwong quickly clarified that he had deduced it himself. Judging by Kwok Kwong's reaction, Tu Hieu thought he might have a useful lead, so he humbly inquired further. But when Kwok Kwong started waffling on about yin, yang, and the 5 elements, Tu Hieu felt this had absolutely nothing to do with the case and politely dismissed him. Kwok Kwong had not given up, but he was stopped by Teo Tin. In the end, he had to leave with a sense of regret. Since the police had no leads, Tu Hieu decided to revisit the crime scene to search once more. Kwok Kwong returned to the archives, his mind still racing over the case, relentlessly hunting for any viable clues. Tu Hieu searched diligently for 2 days, yet he still couldn't find the other half of the corpse. He then thought back to Kwok Kwong's theory of the 5 elements. Meanwhile, a dejected Kwok Kwong was carrying a bottle of liquor back home. His neighbor, Diem Ni, saw him, returning and warmly greeted him, even offering to cook a meal for him herself. Due to the lack of progress on the case, Tu Hieu was summoned to Chief Duong's office for a dressing down. Feeling severely understaffed, Tu Hieu requested more personnel to search for the remaining half of the body, but Chief Duong rejected the proposal. At the search site, Tu Hieu spotted a highly suspicious man in a red jacket. He was about to approach him for questioning, but the man in red bolted the moment he saw the police. Tu Hieu sprinted after him, and together with his colleagues, cornered the man in the woods. The outcome was deeply disappointing for the police. It turned out the man had simply been hired to dump a dead pig. Meanwhile, the forensic pathologist discovered that the symbol on the victim's eye had been drawn before death, whilst the other wounds were inflicted post-mortem. However, forensics still couldn't determine the purpose or cause of these marks. Kwok Kwong sought out Tu Hieu, who was busy analyzing the case with forensics. Tu Hieu maintained that Kwok Kwong's theories were pure superstition and completely useless for solving the crime. Kwok Kwong brought up the case he had cracked years ago to persuade him, but Tu Hyo remained stubbornly dismissive, assuming Kwok Kwong merely wanted to claim some glory before his retirement. Kwok Kwong produced a map with several marked locations, all of which were potential dumping grounds. He demanded that Tu Hyo mobilize his team, guaranteeing that they would find the rest of the body within 2 days. Yet Tu Hyo still hesitated, believing that all this talk of feng shui and the 5 elements was utter nonsense. Time was running out, and manpower was stretched thin. He didn't want to waste any more of either. Reluctantly, Kwok Kwong put the map away, though he made one last war-ditch effort to convince the younger officer. Since Tu Hyo had absolutely no other avenues to explore, he decided to trust Kwok Kwong just this once. The police searched for a long time to no avail, causing the team members to grow doubtful. Although Teo Tin still backed Kwok Kwong, Tu Hyo decided to abandon this line of inquiry, preferring to do things his own way. After 2 days of fruitless searching, panic began to set in amongst the team, who deemed the strategy unviable. Teo Tin phoned Tu Hyo, who then brought Dai Fi to the scene. Everyone was concerned about Kwok Kwong's health. Tu Hyo advised him to call off the search and focus his energy on more vital lines of inquiry. Kwok Kwong insisted on sticking to his plan, personally grabbing a spade to dig up the earth. A heated argument ensued between him and Tu Hyo. During the scuffle, both men tumbled down a slope. Right where they fell, they discovered the remaining half of the corpse. That evening, Kwok Kwong dozed off on a chair and dreamt of his daughter. Just as he woke up, Tu Hyo came to see him, bemoaning the fact that the police still hadn't found the torso. Having found a body part following Kwok Kwong's plan, Tu Hyo now trusted him more and asked for his past investigative expertise. Kwok Kwong advised him to find an expert consultant, leading Tu Hyo to meet an archaeologist named Professor Han. Initially, Professor Han paid them little mind. Suddenly, Tran Nam spotted 2 skeletons locked in an embrace and presumed they were lovers. However, the pelvic bones indicated they were the remains of 2 men. Applying his professional knowledge, Tu Hyo explained to everyone that they weren't lovers, but rather a crime scene where the 2 men had fought to the death. Hearing Tu Hyo's analysis, Professor Han's attitude shifted, forcing him to re-evaluate the detective's competence. Recognizing the officer's capabilities, Professor Han intended to help them personally, but due to a prior time schedule, he dispatched his student Tran Nam to assist instead. On the way back, Tu Hyo incessantly moaned about how absurd it was that in the 21st century, the police had to rely on a female archaeology PhD to solve a case involving a 2,000-year-old murder method. That night, Tran Nam returned home, her thoughts consumed by the 2 murdered young women, and she resolved to seek justice for them. She began analyzing the case using her archaeological expertise. At a karaoke bar, a scantily clad, heavily intoxicated girl stumbled down a corridor. Suddenly, a man in black approached from behind, knocked her out with chloroform, and kidnapped her. He hauled her into a pitch-black cellar. A pre-drawn symbol already marked her eye. He then used a chainsaw to dismember her. The next day, Tu Hyo and Kwok Kwong visited the archaeological site. Drawing on her expertise and the structure of the tomb, Tran Nam provided the police with several clues regarding the dismemberment. However, Tu Hyo was put off by Tran Nam's arrogant demeanor and her occasionally abrasive tone, complaining non-stop on the way back that the police were wasting their time. Kwok Kwong had a gut feeling that the killer would strike again, using old feng shui records to form his theories, but Tu Hyo still insisted that superstitions were unreliable and that the police had to rely on science. Consequently, Tu Hyo took Kwok Kwong to the forensics lab, where they continued working based on the existing clues and the autopsy report. Tu Hyo theorized that the victims might work in the hospitality industry. As such, individuals often have estranged relationships with their families, making it incredibly difficult to identify them. He wanted to track down women working in this sector to gather more information. Following his orders, the police met with several girls, showing them a photo of the victim's distinctive tattoo for identification. Initially, the girls refused to cooperate, fearing they'd drag themselves into trouble. Tu Hyo explained the gravity of the situation. If the police didn't catch the killer, everyone could be in danger. Eventually, 2 girls, Teo Lan and Tan Phuong, recognized the tattoo. Tu Hyo took them to the morgue, where Teo Lan identified the body as her close friend, a lamb. They used to live together when a lamb was alive. Tu Hyo led a team to search their accommodation, but some of the victims' belongings had already been chucked away, hindering the investigation. The male dormitory manager and a cleaner came over to ask what was going on. Tu Hyo found the manager suspicious and ordered Dai Fi to tail him covertly. Dai Fi caught the manager sneakily throwing away a bag, which, upon inspection, was entirely filled with women's underwear. Tu Hyo confronted the manager, who couldn't deny it any longer. He admitted to stealing the victim's belongings to satisfy his own personal fetish, standoffish, but insisted he had absolutely nothing to do with Alam's death. To prove his innocence, he provided Tu Hyo with another lead. Teolan had also nicked a lot of the victim's stuff. Teolan initially denied it, but was eventually forced to confess, handing over all of the victim's cosmetics she had stolen. Tu Hyo hauled both suspects back to the police station. Whilst Tu Hyo was deeply engrossed in the case, Chief Duong arrived with two colleagues from another department, stating they had just cracked a case, but some details still didn't quite add up logically. Coincidentally, there was a missing woman who remained unfound, which matched the case. Tu Hyo was investigating. Chief Duong therefore wanted to run a DNA comparison. During a quiet moment, Tu Hyo suddenly thought of his mother. He had been so swamped with the case lately that he hadn't had time to visit her. Feeling guilty, he rang her. She was incredibly understanding about his job, offering no reproach, and assured him she was in good health so he wouldn't worry. After comparing the DNA samples and uncovering fresh leads, the police discovered certain anomalous marks on the victim's intimate areas. Because they were so well hidden, the killer hadn't noticed them, and therefore hadn't removed them. On another torrential night in the woods, a man in a raincoat stood under the dim beam of a torch, digging a hole with a spade. Suddenly, a car approached. Tu Hyo, who was observing from a distance, quickly hid himself. A figure stepped out of the vehicle, also carrying a spade to dig a hole. The man in black from earlier swiftly drew a gun, declaring himself to be the police. It turned out to be Kwok Kwong. He wanted to use the rainy night to sneakily hunt for clues. However, Kwok Kwong was ambushed and knocked unconscious. He was rushed to the hospital. Upon hearing the news, Tu Hyo immediately went to visit him. Kwok Kwong recounted his encounter with the killer and personally led Tu Hyo back to the scene. Tu Hyo told him off for recklessly investigating alone, stating he should have phoned him first. Spotting the killer's van, Kwok Kwong led the search party around the area where he was attacked, eventually finding the abandoned vehicle submerged in a pond. Once hoisted out, a dismembered female body was found inside. Seeing the corpse, Kwok Kwong was visibly crushed. Tu Hyo felt a twinge of guilt seeing him like this, especially since it was Kwok Kwong's birthday. Had Tu Hyo listened and called for backup, they might have caught the killer. He tried to comfort the older man, but Kwok Kwong remained deep in mourning, his heart aching for a father who had lost his child. Using clues from the van, Tu Hyo tracked down its original owner, who, as it turned out, had reported it stolen. Over 10 days ago, Tu Hyo and Kwok Kwong found a public bicycle at the theft scene and traced its last user to Min Nia, the brother-in-law of the stolen van's owner. They went to Min Nia's residence, but he made a run for it the moment he saw the police. Working together, Tu Hyo and Kwok Kwong apprehended him. Just then, Tran Nam rang Tu Hyo about a new discovery, urging him to come to the scene. However, Tu Hyo still felt that collaborating with an archaeologist was dodgy, and having just caught a new suspect, he wanted to interrogate him straight away, so he didn't go to meet her. Min Nia proved uncooperative during the interrogation. Sussing him out, the police pretended to give up and started casually discussing his past, prompting Min Nia to confess to the car theft, though he continued to cover up his brother-in-law's involvement. Kwok Kwong also sensed he was holding back, but the suspect wouldn't budge. Under intense grilling, Min Nia finally coughed up a crucial lead. The van had been used by someone named Dai Min. Tu Hyo had forgotten about Tran Nam's earlier call. She rang back to complain, but Tu Hyo still didn't take it seriously, causing her to angrily hang up. Right after, Kwok Kwong told Tu Hyo that Dai Min used to be a tomb raider. Tu Hyo was forced to seek out Tran Nam once more. Despite her fury, she put the VAR investigation first and shared what she had unearthed in the ancient tomb. The police wiretapped Dai Min's phone, but since the suspect spoke in code, the police couldn't understand the content, though they guessed the gang would strike that night. Tu Hyo led a team to lay a covert ambush nearby. Upon observing him, they noticed Dai Min was left-handed, which perfectly matched the man in black who had attacked Kwok Kwong. Moreover, Kwok Kwong deciphered their code, realizing Dai Min was planning a tomb raid. For safety's sake, he told Tu Hyo to call for backup. As they watched Dai Min dig, Kwok Kwong repeatedly urged Tu Hyo to arrest him, but Tu Hyo argued their primary focus was the murder case, which this raid had nothing to do with, and opted to keep watching. Consequently, after the two suspects entered the tomb, a massive explosion violently rocked the site. Familiar with tombs, Kwok Kwong knew something was terribly wrong and sprang into action, forcing Tu Hyo to give chase. An accomplice keeping watch outside put up a fierce fight when he saw the police, making the arrest extremely difficult. Having worked so hard to find this lead, Kwok Kwong refused to give up, even wanting to dig into the tomb to save the two trapped men. The lead had vanished into thin air, leaving Kwok Kwong bitterly disappointed and Tu Hyo feeling guilty. Had he listened to Kwok Kwong, they would have caught the suspect. Dai Min's captured accomplice was incredibly stubborn, refusing to utter a word during interrogation. Kwok Kwong went to the library alone, reminiscing reminiscing about his daughter. Distraught over losing the killer's trail, he got completely plastered and fell asleep on his doorstep. The kind-hearted Dame found him and helped him inside, moved to tears when she heard him talk about missing his daughter, though she didn't know how to console him and quietly left. The next day, Tran Nam went to thank Tu Hyo. During his previous visit to the tomb for clues, Tu Hyo had provided her with some highly valuable archaeological insights. To show her gratitude, Tran Nam visited Kwok Kwong alongside Tu Hyo, though she felt the gift Tu Hyo had chosen was rather inappropriate. When they arrived at Kwok Kwong's flat, he was fast asleep from the booze and didn't hear the knocking. Tu Hyo's persistent knocking disturbed Dame across the hall, who came out to see what was going on. Learning they were looking for Kwok Kwong, she grabbed her keys to let them in. Just then, Kwok Kwong woke up and opened the door. Dame immediately greeted him with profound care and affection. Her evident warmth led Tu Hyo and Tran Nam to suspect their relationship was anything but ordinary. Tu Hyo realized Kwok Kwong had ulterior motives for wanting to catch the killer and didn't hesitate to ask him outright. Kwok Kwong recounted a case from 10 years ago involving a tomb raider named Jia Hak, suspecting Dai Min was connected to him. Hearing that Dai Min hailed from Chu Lei village, Kwok Kwong was desperate to head there immediately. Recognizing the name of the village as a notorious haven for tomb raiders, Tran Nam insisted on tagging along. The trio arrived at the village to hunt for clues. They learned that Dai Min was a heavy drinker with a penchant for violence, regularly beating his wife, and that he ran a poultry farm on the outskirts of the village. Tu Hyo and Tran Nam dashed to the farm to investigate, leaving Kwok Kwong in the village to dig up info on the connection between Jia Hak and Dai Min. He sought out an elderly man named Ba Han, the keeper of the clan's genealogy book, and discovered the two men were uncle and nephew. At the farm, Tu Hyo and Tran Nam found a slaughterhouse equipped with chainsaws and other tools, and promptly rang Kwok Kwong to come over. Tu Hyo discovered a jade pendant under Dai Min's pillow. The moment Kwok Kwong arrived, he recognized it as the exact pendant the man in black wore during the attack. Furthermore, Jia Hak had been clutching an identical piece of jade when he died, proving they were a pair. As they examined the scene, Ho Dan, a fresh food shop owner, arrived to collect goods from Dai Min. Having known him through his wife and visiting monthly for eggs and chickens, Tu Hyo called in his colleagues to process the scene, where forensics confirmed a massive amount of human blood. The case had finally yielded another lead. That night, Kwok Kwong returned to his daughter's room, reliving sweet memories of her. Meanwhile, Tran Nam noticed that Dai Min's house lacked any books beyond secondary school level, let alone texts on feng shui, indicating he had absolutely no knowledge of such matters. She phoned Tu Hyo to share her suspicions, which he also shared, prompting him to plan another trip to the farm, with Tran Nam joining him. When they arrived, they spotted someone inside and quietly observed, astonished to find it was Kwok Kwong. He had already found out that Dai Min was hot-headed, careless, and drowning in online gambling debt. Hardly the profile of a mastermind capable of executing such a complex crime. Tu Hyo and Kwok Kwong noticed anomalies in the blood spatter, and after conducting experiments back at the station, confirmed the farm crime scene was entirely staged. Although there were new leads, the investigation hit a wall as the prime suspect, Tan Xiao, flatly refused to cooperate, preferring to take the fall rather than dish out any useful intel. Tu Tin theorized that Tan Xiao was keeping his mouth shut because snitching on his accomplices would result in consequences far worse than taking the blame himself. At this juncture, Chief Duong and Tao Sun visited the task force to offer encouragement and check on their progress. Tu Hyo had Tio Tin brief them. Despite Tan Xiao's silence, the police had uncovered his close ties to a woman named Lan Lan, with whom he frequently exchanged money. Tu Hyo decided to track her down for more information. He led his team to her, but she was equally uncooperative, refusing to say a single word. Tu Hyo brought up her child to wear her down, finally getting her to talk and agree to meet Tan Xiao. At the detention center, the sight of Lan Lan and his child softened Tan Xiao, prompting him to confess everything. He was absolutely certain about the amount of explosives used, yet another blast had occurred when they were raiding the tomb, meaning someone highly skilled had secretly interfered. Only about 5 people in the tomb raiding underworld were capable of such a feat. Tan Xiao had kept quiet out of fear for his family's safety. He revealed that the man pulling Dai Min's strings was incredibly bizarre, deeply obsessed with feng shui, and slept in a coffin in his his bedroom every single night. Furthermore, this mastermind had provided the intel for the tomb raid and met with Dai Min beforehand, a meeting Than Seo himself had facilitated. Armed with this crucial lead, Tu Hugh led his team to hunt down this mastermind, but found the room empty. When Tu Hugh pried open the coffin, he discovered Ho Dan dead inside. Observing ligature marks on the victim's wrists, Tu Hugh deduced Ho Dan had been tied up and had struggled fruitlessly inside the coffin. Kwok Kwong noticed a wound on Ho Dan's leg, recalling the rainy night he had injured the man in black, identifying Ho Dan as the mastermind. To ensure no stone was left unturned, Kwok Kwong called Tran Nam in, hoping she could find more clues. Sure enough, they found several antiques in the room, confirming it belonged to Ho Dan, the man pulling the strings behind Dai Min, alongside a photograph of Jia Hak. Suspecting Ho Dan's true identity, Kwok Kwong returned to Chulei village to confront Ba Han, informing him of Ho Dan's murder and deducing he was Jia Hak's son. Knowing Ba Han was hiding something, and with Ho Dan now dead, Ba Han finally spilled the beans. It turned out Jia Hak's father was from Ba Han's generation. When Ba Han's son fell, gravely ill with no money for treatment, the wealthy Jia Hak stepped in to save him. Ho Dan was Jia Hak's illegitimate son, who had begged Ba Han to erase his name from the Chu clan's genealogy book. To repay Jia Hak for saving his son, Ba Han obliged, meaning no one else knew of this illegitimate child. Jia Hak had done this because he anticipated trouble and wanted to secure an escape route for his son. Tu Hio continued combing the scene, piecing together the events and uncovering how Ho Dan was murdered. Meanwhile, Kwok Kwong and Tran Nam, having acquired vital clues at Ba Han's house, attempted to bring him to the station as he was still hiding facts. Just then, a mob of village youths, all involved in tomb raiding, rushed in to stop them, intent on murdering Ba Han to silence him. Kwok Kwong desperately stalled for time whilst Tran Nam covertly phoned Tu Hugh, who was too engrossed in the crime scene to answer. In a life-or-death situation, Tran Nam fabricated a story about a tomb filled with treasure, which successfully tempted the mob into sparing them. Seeing Tran Nam's missed calls, Tu Hio knew something was terribly wrong and rang back while speeding towards their location. Arriving after the danger had passed, Kwok Kwong arranged to meet Tu Hio at Daida's house, sharing a massive breakthrough. The Chu family had another son named Daida, and Ho Dan was, in fact, Daida. The trio found a tooth in Daida's house. Tran Nam ordered the Tomb King's skull to be brought in, and the tooth was a perfect match, proving Jia Hak had infiltrated this very tomb years ago. Tran Nam deduced that Jia Hak's safe must contain a tortoise shell taken from the tomb, inscribed with the secret to immortality. Kwok Kwong recalled the case from 10 years ago. While hiding a body, Jia Hak was spotted by a couple whose testimony led the police to the corpse. But the investigation was fraught with difficulties. Cornered by the police, Jia Hak took his own life right in front of them to conceal Daida's existence, completely pulling the wool over their eyes, allowing Daida to inherit the tortoise shell and the immortality ritual. Tu Hugh found this utterly baffling. Unable to fathom how anyone in the modern age could believe such drivel, Tran Nam theorized Daida was brewing the elixir of life. Identifying his roof as a potential alchemical furnace, Tu Hugh deduced Jia Hak adopted Dai Min solely to use him as a scapegoat for Daida, killing him in the tomb explosion to throw the police off the scent, never anticipating someone else would murder Daida and nick the tortoise shell. Meanwhile, Dai Fi and Tio Tin extracted leads from Daida's ex-girlfriend. Concurrently, Tu Hugh drove Tran Nam home, but they violently clashed over the case. Tu Hugh dismissed it as pure superstition, whilst Tran Nam relied on logical deduction, leading to an unresolved stalemate. Tu Hugh returned to the station to update Chief Duong and Tao San. The real Ho Dan, whose identity Daida had stolen, was already dead, but his family hadn't cancelled his registration, selling his documents to traffickers instead, giving Daida the perfect cover. The police also tracked down Chu Hao, Dai Min's trusted underling. Tu Hugh suspected Chu Hao murdered Daida to avenge Dai Min. Based on this, Dai Fi believed catching Chu Hao would close the case, but Kwok Kwong insisted there was another player, as the circle of crime was far too flawless. Looking back at the decade-old case, the police suspected a second Jia Hak Dai dynamic was emerging. Elsewhere, Director Triu carefully stashed the tortoise shell he had just acquired. Just then his phone rang. It was his mysterious superior, who had deduced that Chu Hao lacked the bottle to commit murder, and that Director Trio was definitely pulling the strings. Trio vehemently denied this, his true goal being to act independently once he had the bone, callously telling his boss, that Dai Da's death benefited everyone. He then hung up and switched off his phone. Meanwhile, Tran Nam made a fresh discovery in the ancient tomb and immediately phoned Tu Hieu, promising to report back once she had investigated thoroughly, hoping it would aid his case. Back at the station, Tiu Ting dug out the entire case file Kwa Kuang had handled 10 years ago. Compiling documents on the Chu family's illicit activities, she discovered there were actually 2 female victims a decade ago, yet Kwa Kuang had only reported 1 death, with the other completely wiped from the records. Furthermore, the file showed Kwa Kuang was just a county CID officer back then, not city police. It was precisely because he investigated the Chu family case that he got promoted to the city bureau. Tu Hieu reviewed Kwa Kuang's entire involvement in the current case, finding it riddled with suspicious discrepancies. To dig deeper, Tu Hieu went to Dai Da's house alone, only to find Kwa Kuang already there. Seizing the moment, Tu Hieu grilled him about the old case, but Kwa Kuang rigidly maintained there was only 1 victim. Knowing he was hiding something, Tu Hieu confronted him directly, only for Kwa Kuang to turn the tables and question Tu Hieu instead, even exposing details about Tu Hieu's own background, stating everyone has secrets they'd rather keep hidden. Just then, the forensic pathologist rang to report the discovery of a placenta. While highly nutritious, trading human placentas is strictly illegal. That night, Kwa Kuang went home, overwhelmed with grief as he thought of his daughter once again. Meanwhile, Tu Hieu visited the hospital's maternity ward to see Dr. Li. The moment he spoke, she knew exactly why he was there and recounted the whole story without holding anything back. Simultaneously, Kwa Kuang visited another hospital, posing as a buyer to approach a doctor, discovering they too were illegally selling placentas, and subsequently called Tu Hieu over. Tran Nam visited the museum to examine the old cauldron, but was obstructed by the glass display. Wanting a closer look, she asked the receptionist for permission to take it out. The receptionist's face instantly dropped, and she rattled off a string of excuses to refuse. Sensing a cover-up, Tran Nam suspected something dodgy was going on at the museum. She claimed she wanted to build a new museum, but the staff said the director was away on business. Knowing something was off but keeping quiet, Tran Nam waited until the receptionist was distracted, sneaked to the back, and nicked the cauldron. Tu Hieu and Kwa Kuang then tracked down Bin Duc, a wealthy merchant, to interrogate him about buying placentas. Bin Duc confessed that Dai Da had introduced him to trade and was completely transparent with them. He had met Dai Da at an antique shop and initially got on well with him, but later sensed Dai Da was a bit sketchy and deliberately distanced himself. Finding no further leads, Tu Hieu and Kwa Kuang prepared to leave, warning Bin Duc that buying placentas was not only illegal but also carried severe disease risks, leaving the merchant utterly terrified. Because Tran Nam had moved the artifact without permission, the museum called the police to arrest her. She demanded they contact Tu Hieu, who immediately drove over to bail her out. On the way, he recalled his chat with Bin Duc. As they parted, the merchant had bowed politely but touched his hair in a highly peculiar manner. Tu Hieu collected Tran Nam from the station, intentionally questioning her actions to avoid suspicion. She explained everything about the cauldron to Tu Hieu and the station chief, Ho Thien, revealing that the museum's cauldron was a fake, whereas the one at Dai Da's house was the genuine article. Gobsmacked, Tu Hieu and Ho Thien decided to visit the museum together to investigate. Kwa Kuang marked several spots on a map, dispatching officers to each to check for missing girls. Tu Hieu and the others arrived at the museum, where the manager, hearing the police were investigating, personally welcomed them with immense enthusiasm. However, the moment he heard the cauldron was fake, he fiercely denied it and pinned all the blame on Tran Nam, leading to a blazing row where both accused the other. Knowing the manager was trying to wriggle out of it, Tu Hieu laid down the law, threatening to seal off the museum for illegal antique trafficking, detailing the catastrophic consequences. The manager looked panicked, but before he could even utter a word, the receptionist stepped forward and blew the whistle, revealing he had sold off all the real antiques. Kwa Kuang and Dai Fi were staking out the city center slums when they spotted 2 thugs extorting money from a bar girl, demanding to know the whereabouts of her friend, Din Dang. They swiftly arrested the thugs, but the bar girl fled at the sight of the police. Kwa Kuang gave chase, finding him approachable. She took him to her flat while searching for Din Dang inside. They were suddenly ambushed. The attacker was incredibly strong, and given Kwa Kuang's age, he was outmatched and pinned to the floor by his neck. Catching sight of Din Dang hiding under the bed, Kwa Kuang watched as she slid a small spade towards him, which he quickly grabbed to knock his attacker out cold. As backup flooded in, Din Dang remained petrified under the bed until Kwa Kuang gently coaxed her out. Faced with a mountain of evidence, the museum manager was forced to confess to trafficking antiques. Because the museum was in an isolated area with few visitors and couldn't pay its staff, he thought he wouldn't get caught and sold genuine artifacts to cover their wages, even sketching a portrait of the buyer, a drug addict. Based on this fresh intel, Tu-hyo concluded Daida wasn't the mastermind, as he couldn't possibly have obtained the real antiques. Tran Nam argued that cracking the secret of the immortality sacrificial ritual would blow the case wide open. While Tu-hyo was driving Tran Nam, Dai-Fi rang to report a new lead, forcing Tu-hyo to rush back to the station, with Tran Nam insisting on tagging along. Kwok Kwong and Teo Ting interrogated Din Dang, but her mental state was incredibly fragile. Kwok Kwong kindly played some soothing music to relax her. Her friend recounted that on the night Din Dang returned, her legs were covered in blood, but this vague detail offered little help to the case. Tu-hyo believed they should push Din Dang to remember more, but she became violently distressed and unstable. Recognizing her psychological trauma, Tran Nam advised everyone to stop triggering her and change their interrogation tactics. Since Kwok Kwong had to stay at the station, he asked Tu-hyo to fetch his medication. Worried about his health, DM Ni also turned up at the station. The forensic pathologist examined Din Dang, discovering multiple injuries, notably a bizarrely shaped wound on her back. Tu-hyo drove DM Ni home. During the ride, she casually inquired about the case, but Tu-hyo cited protocol and kept quiet, which she understood and didn't press further, pivoting to his personal life instead. Upon learning he was single, she eagerly offered to set him up on a blind date. DM Ni brought homemade chicken soup to the station, earning praise from everyone. When Kwok Kwong gave his portion to Din Dang, DM Ni's affection for him only grew. Hearing Din Dang's tragic story, she was deeply sympathetic and worried about Kwok Kwong's health, approached Tu-hyo to discuss taking the girl home to care for her. Since Din Dang was a crucial witness and a victim, letting DM Ni take her was strictly against protocol, putting Tu-hyo in a tight spot, though he ultimately caved to her relentless pleading. Before leaving, Din Dang whispered something into her friend's ear, an act Tu-hyo managed to catch. Din Dang was then taken to Kwok Kwong's house, feeling it inappropriate for him to be alone with a young woman. DM Ni moved in to help. That night, seeing the wounds on the sleeping girl's body, DM Ni was heartbroken. Kwok Kwong, meanwhile, dreamt of his daughter again. The next morning, over breakfast, Kwok Kwong pressed Din Dang about the car's number plate, urging her to remember, but she vehemently resisted, having severe meltdowns whenever he brought it up. Unable to bear her distress, DM Ni urged Kwok Kwong to stop forcing it. Concurrently, Tu-hyo asked Chief Duong about Kwok Kwong's past, discovering his transfer to the city bureau was directly ordered by the provincial department. While Kwok Kwong and DM Ni were out grocery shopping, they left Din Dang alone in the house. She sneakily rummaged through Kwok Kwong's belongings, uncovering his family photo. It turned out Din Dang had been faking her trauma all along. Her mind was perfectly sound. Meanwhile, Tu-hyo, Dai-fi, and Teo Ting arrived at the ancient tomb to find Tran Nam, seeking to understand the sacrificial ritual. Learning that the ritual required burying people alive alongside the dead, a wave of sheer dread washed over them all, knowing full well that the longer this dragged on, the more victims would inevitably follow. Furthermore, Tu-hyo wanted to force Din Dang to reveal what she knew. Whilst cooking, DM Ni continued to fuss over Din Dang. She and Kwok Kwong had differing views on Din Dang's future. DM Ni believed Din Dang should learn a trade, so she could fend for herself later in life. However, Kwok Kwong felt that since Din Dang was still young, she needed to go to school. He even wanted to pay her tuition fees. Because Din Dang slept in Kwok Kwong's daughter's room, when she opened the door and stepped out, Kwok Kwong felt as though he was seeing his own daughter. But when he saw Din Dang holding his daughter's hair bow, he became somewhat annoyed. Holding the bow in his hands, Kwok Kwong continuously reminisced about the beautiful memories he shared with his daughter. This also brought back the agonizing pain of losing her. It was precisely because of his daughter's death and his wife's subsequent blame that Kwok Kwong and his wife had divorced. He hid in a dark room, weeping alone, just as Din Dang caught sight of him crying. To quickly crack the case, Tu-hyo was reviewing the entire investigative process in his mind. The image of Din Dang leaving with Kwok Kwong flashed through his mind again. Tu-hyo felt there was something amiss in the way she had looked at Kwok Kwong then, not to mention her whispering to her friend. Tu-hyo once again grew suspicious of Kwok Kwong's past, prompting him to ring a police officer named Su. Officer Su told Tu-hyo that Kwok Kwong had been transferred to the city police bureau because his daughter had died in an accident. His wife had divorced him over the tragedy. Kwok Kwong had requested a transfer from the organization, and his superiors at the time had agreed. However, when Tu-hyo tried to probe further into the cause of his daughter's death, Officer Su went silent. Desperate for Din Dang to provide a lead, Tu-hyo relentlessly searched for a way. Previously, Tran Nam had volunteered to help, but Tu Hiu had refused. Now, however, he wanted to let her have a go, so he brought her to Kwok Kwong's house. Upon meeting, Tran Nam wanted to use psychological methods to soothe Din Dang's nerves, a technique that would aid in uncovering clues for the case. Kwong worried that rushing things would further traumatize Din Dang, wanting to give her more time to adjust. Tu Hiu, on the other hand, argued that catching the spring killer swiftly was paramount, and Kwok Kwong could not let personal feelings delay the investigation. Tran Nam employed psychological techniques to help Din Dang recall the events of that night. But the more Din Dang remembered, the worse her state of mind became. Her body grew overwhelmingly tense. After a while, Tran Nam successfully guided her to recover her memories. She stepped out, deeply admiring Din Dang's bravery. Kwok Kwong also understood Din Dang's panic. At that time, she had been locked in a car boot with a dismembered corpse. Such horrific circumstances were enough to drive anyone mad. But Kwok Kwong questioned why the killer hadn't buried the body before going out to kidnap someone. Tu Hiu theorized that the killer might have stumbled upon his next target before having the chance to bury the corpse. Hence the kidnapping of Din Dang. Tran Nam suggested reconstructing the crime scene to search for clues, hoping for an unexpected breakthrough. Kwok Kwong felt this method was far too cruel for Din Dang. Tu Hiu believed that the longer the delay, the higher the likelihood of another victim. The police needed to crack the case quickly to catch the culprit. Kwok Kwong pleaded for more time for Din Dang, but Tu Hiu only granted him a 2-day deadline. To build Din Dang's courage, Kwok Kwong took her to a pitch-black building to search for a cat. He used this opportunity to tell Din Dang that the police would reconstruct the crime scene to trigger her memory. Having spent considerable time with Kwok Kwong, Din Dang had developed a genuine fondness for him. After helping him find the cat, Din Dang expressed her desire to continue staying at his house. Following Din Dang's consent, the investigative team quickly made arrangements, simulating her kidnapping, but ultimately, she still couldn't recall any useful clues. This left Tu Hiu somewhat frustrated. Since the police had tried multiple times to no avail, he was forced to take Din Dang away. However, Kwok Kwong wanted her to stay. He noticed that Din Dang had begun to listen to him. She even took the initiative to read, study, wake up early to make breakfast, and cook his favorite dishes. Yet Tu Hiu argued that Din Dang was only complying with Kwok Kwong's wishes because she was secretly observing him, plotting to use him. Tu Hiu believed it would be highly dangerous to let her stay by Kwok Kwong's side. Furthermore, bringing up Din Dang's rather unsavory past, noting she had dropped out of school in the 7th year. All of this pointed to Din Dang being a lazy, idle child, and Kwok Kwong was simply her next target. Kwok Kwong dismissed this entirely. Tu Hiu was forced to recount the day Kwok Kwong brought Din Dang home. Although she had whispered to her friend, Tu Hiu had read the friend's lips, deducing that she had said the opportunity had arrived. Clearly, the two girls were conspiring to take advantage of Kwok Kwong. But acting as a father figure, Kwok Kwong wasn't overly bothered by this. Conversely, he wanted to give Din Dang another chance. It turned out that the night before, Din Dang had confessed everything, revealing she had sneakily read his daughter's diary and knew he loved radish dumplings. Tu Hiu maintained that people like Din Dang wouldn't change, leaving the two men at a bitter impasse. Just then, Tran Nam approached, sensing Tu Hiu's deep concern for Kwok Kwong, prompting him to recount a case he had handled years ago. There was an ordinary, relatively modest couple who kindly provided financial support to an impoverished student. However, the student neglected his studies and instead mixed with an unsavory crowd. When the couple ceased their funding, the student harbored bitter resentment and murdered them. Since then, Tu Hiu's mindset had completely shifted, believing that one should only do good deeds within their means and always be on guard against others. Because Din Dang couldn't recall anything, she felt terribly guilty. Knowing she could no longer stay, she voluntarily asked to leave. At this moment, however, Kwok Kwong announced he would rent out the room for 500 renminbi a month, wanting to give Din Dang a reason to stay. Hearing this, Din Dang was profoundly moved and racked with guilt. As she had previously intended to exploit him, she immediately burst into tears. But right then, she suddenly recalled a clue. Amongst the men who kidnapped her that night, one was wearing a wig. Upon hearing this, Tu Hiu quickly cast his mind back to his interrogation with Bin Duck. As the police left, Bin Duck had bowed slightly whilst using his hand to hold his hair in place, a highly suspicious gesture. Tu Hiu instantly dispatched a team to dig up information on Bin Duck. That evening, Tu Hiu drove Tran Nam home. Noticing the garage lights were incredibly dim, he intended to walk her right to her door, but not wanting to bother him, she declined. After the investigative team returned to the station, Dai Fi also uncovered a lead regarding Bin Duck. He was stunned to discover that that Di Han, the man they had been tirelessly searching for, was actually Bin Duk's son with his ex-wife, adding massive weight to Bin Duk's suspicious profile. Tu Hyo ordered his men to keep a tight tail on Bin Duk. Whilst Tu Hyo and Kwok Kwong scoured for clues, their colleagues unearthed more vital intel. Bin Duk's company had previously focused on civil construction before transitioning to garden landscape design. This clue strongly linked Bin Duk to tomb raiding, as working in excavation meant he would immediately know if there were burial grounds beneath the properties. Arriving at his office, Bin Duk rang his accomplice, Chin No, requesting a meeting. The police intercepted their call. As Bin Duk headed out to meet Chin No, Dai Fi shadowed him. Since Chin No was giving an interview at the time, Bin Duk was forced to wait. Tu Hyo and the rest of the team also waited on standby. Meanwhile, another unit uncovered fresh intelligence. Di Hien had been shot in the US 3 days prior whilst using illegal substances. Tu Hyo was utterly bewildered upon hearing this. Dai, Min, Dai Da and Di Hien had all been killed precisely as the police closed in on them. Kwok Kwong deduced that someone was engaged in a deadly race against the police. At this juncture, Chin No was murdered by Bin Duk. Tu Hyo and Kwok Kwong raced to the scene. Kwok Kwong noticed a symbol drawn over Chin No's eye, identical to the one on his daughter's eye before she died. Following the murder, Bin Duk swiftly ducked into a washroom to disguise himself before fleeing. Tu Hyo, Kwok Kwong, and Dai Fi promptly reviewed the CCTV footage together, spotting Bin Duk's figure. Yet shortly after, he vanished without a trace, leading everyone to suspect he was deliberately dodging the cameras. Kwok Kwong and Dai Fi set off to hunt him down, whilst Tu Hyo remained in the security room, his eyes glued to the monitors. Upon confirming via the radio, Kwok Kwong learned Bin Duk had entered the fire escape on the 10th floor. He immediately charged into the stairwell in hot pursuit. However, Kwok Kwong suffered a sudden heart attack. By the time he caught up, Bin Duk had already shed his disguise. Fighting through the excruciating chest pain, Kwok Kwong chased Bin Duk all the way to the underground car park. Tu Hyo returned once more to Chin No's murder scene, discovering a wound inflicted by a Luoyang spade, which he photographed and sent to Tran Nam for her expert opinion. Chin No's employees all insisted he was a fantastic boss, yet none of them knew Bin Duk. Kwok Kwong also discovered that Bin Duk had fled in a taxi, tracking down the female driver for questioning. Ultimately, he learned Bin Duk had switched to a motorcycle taxi. The motorbike driver told the police that Bin Duk had arranged to return in a few days. Afterwards, Tu Hyo led a team to search Bin Duk's home, but his wife stubbornly refused to cooperate, and her solicitor constantly obstructed them. Tu Hyo was forced to produce a search warrant and execute the raid. The solicitor presented Bin Duk's divorce agreement, arguing that the couple were no longer related, thus barring the police from arbitrarily entering someone else's property. However, the police had already established that Bin Duk still lived with his wife. The solicitor had a pre-prepared excuse, claiming Bin Duk refused to leave the house, forcing his wife to cohabit with her ex-husband. Kwok Kwong hit back with evidence of Bin Duk's bank transfers, showing he had shifted all his personal assets into his wife's name, definitively proving they were still involved, and incredibly close at that. Furthermore, the police found numerous SIM cards and SIM cutters inside the house. From a calendar found in the residence, Tu Hyo deduced Bin Duk's accomplices possessed an identical one, communicating at designated times using different SIM cards. With Bin Duk's wife still feigning ignorance, Tu Hyo slapped down photos of Bin Duk's previous murders. Nauseated by the gruesome sight, she bolted to the washroom to vomit. Tu Hyo's brutal tactic proved effective. When she emerged, she was far more cooperative. Although she knew nothing of her husband's murders, she agreed to share everything she knew, even providing a list of places Bin Duk might hide. Kwok Kwong produced a photo of the mark on Bin Duk's body, learning they had divorced right after it appeared. Bin Duk knew he was doomed to a grim end, prompting him to sever ties with his wife via divorce. Tran Nam also discovered a hoard of antiques and several small pills in the house, accidentally stumbling upon evidence that Bin Duk had consulted a fortune teller before fleeing. The reading indicated he should head southwest. Tran Nam suggested focusing the search in that direction. Tu Hyo dismissed this as superstitious twaddle, insisting the police couldn't crack a case based on mysticism, a sentiment Kwok Kwong echoed. The wife's solicitor continued to run interference, severely hampering the investigation. Yet no matter what Kwok Kwong said, the solicitor maintained an infuriatingly calm exterior, making it glaringly obvious she had no intention of playing ball. Tu Hyo and Kwok Kwong revisited Chin No's company for leads. The staff unanimously sang his praises as an excellent boss who frequently helped struggling employees. Amidst the search, a female employee admitted she knew Bin Duk. She had simply been too petrified the day before to recall it. She explained their company had previously partnered with Bin Duk's, and she had inadvertently learned Chin-no had always been single. Kwok Kwong suggested tossing Chin-no's flat for clues. During the sweep, Kwok Kwong stumbled upon a secret room. It was decked out like a meditation chamber, with paintings of ancient ascetics adorning the walls. Tearing through the hidden room, Kwok Kwong found a tortoise shell stashed in a concealed drawer. Tu-hyo instantly had it whisked back to the station for cross-referencing. In Chin-no's study, Tu-hyo found the exact same setup as Bin Duk's, heaps of different phones and SIM cards, alongside phone-destroying tools. Based on this kit, Kwok Kwong deduced they were dealing with a three-man syndicate, with Dai Min and the rest serving merely as expendable foot soldiers. Piecing the clues together, Tu-hyo and Kwok Kwong arrived at a solid theory. Chin-no likely hired hitmen to take out Dai Da and Di Hien, and had intended to off Bin Duk as well. But Bin Duk beat him to the punch. The police retrieved a digital camera from Chin-no's home, absolutely packed with snaps of a scantily clad woman performing provocative dances, along with several highly indecent videos. Tu-hyo booted up Chin-no's PC, finding it likewise stuffed with videos of the same woman. The tortoise shell from Chin-no's flat perfectly matched the indentation on Daida's mattress, heavily suggesting it was the very same shell. Tu-hyo and Kwok Kwong tracked down Chin-no's mistress for questioning. Initially unfazed by their probing, her face visibly tightened the moment she learned of Chin-no's death. Buckling under Kwok Kwong's relentless grilling, she spilled the beans on her affair with Chin-no. It turned out their supposedly illicit relationship was purely visual. They had never actually touched, as Chin-no suffered from a condition and only used her for psychological stimulation. Meanwhile, Tran Nam was still neck-deep in the ancient tomb excavation. Director Bang of the property firm came to see her. His company had unearthed the tomb whilst developing the site. Though the dig was done, they desperately needed Tran Nam's signature to resume construction. Whilst reviewing the contract, Tran Nam spotted a partnership between Bang's firm and Chin-no's, and noted the two men were old university mates. Probing for dirt on Chin-no, she learned he was a massive ladies' man in his student days, racking up a mountain of romantic debts. In his final year, he was dating a girl when her actual boyfriend caught them red-handed. The bloke pelted him with ice blocks and gave him a spectacularly savage beating. Yet, thoroughly humiliated, Chin-no never dared report it to the police. Director Bang also happened to mention Chin-no had a massive crush on a female musician, though nothing ever came of it. Realizing this intel was gold, Tran Nam wanted to keep Bang on the hook, using this excuse of reviewing the contract to delay her signature. After seeing Bang off, she instantly tracked down Tu-hyo and Kwok Kwong to relay her findings. Tu-hyo reckoned this gossip was utterly useless for cracking the case. Instead, he whipped out a photo of the ancient script on the tortoise shell and asked for her translation. Tran Nam took one look and identified the text as a record of the immortality ritual. However, it was split in two. This shell only contained half the method, meaning they needed the other piece for the complete ritual. Tu-hyo and Kwok Kwong decided to hunt down the female musician Chin-no, fancied for more leads. But the pair hadn't spoken in ages. She could only offer that she had once accompanied Chin-no to an underground antique exhibition hosted by Bin Duk. She held Chin-no in high regard, viewing him as a perfect gentleman who never pressured her into anything she didn't want. Still, she dropped a massive bombshell. Chin-no had taken her to a restaurant run by Hai Dao, one of Bin Duk's lackeys. The restaurant's fortune reading pointed dead southwest, exactly the auspicious direction Tran Nam had predicted. Tu-hyo mobilized his squad to Hai Dao's diner, heavily fortifying the area to sniff out Bin Duk. Tu-hyo and his crew waited an eternity, but Bin Duk never showed. They bided their time until Hai Dao slipped into a deserted alleyway before boxing him in. Initially uncooperative, Hai Dao looked at Bin Duk's mugshot and lied through his teeth, claiming the bloke was just a punter who'd popped in a few days ago. Tu-hyo, already fully aware of their connection, instantly ripped his lie to shreds. Cornered, Hai Dao had to confess, leading the police to Bin Duk's old hideout to turn it over. During the raid, Kwok Kwong noticed the room's layout was a chillingly exact replica of the scene where his daughter was murdered. The trauma triggered a severe heart attack, rushing him straight to the hospital. Tu-hyo realized Kwok Kwong was definitely holding out on him, so he rang Officer Su to dig up the older detective's past. Officer Su was forced to spill the whole bloody truth. It turned out Kwok Kwong had previously headed a dismemberment case where the butcher was none other than Jia Hak. Initially, Jia Hak tried to bribe him, but Kwok Kwong wouldn't bite. In response, Jia Hak snatched Kwok Kwong's daughter, aiming to strong-arm him into dropping the investigation. Yet Kwok Kwong stubbornly refused to back down, so Jia Hak slaughtered the girl. Learning of Kwok Kwong's tragic history sent Tu-hyo into a blinding rage. He stormed stormed the interrogation room, fully intent on battering Hai Dao. Chief Duong in the top brass, monitoring from the adjacent viewing room, frantically ordered men to drag Tu Hyo out. Chief Duong demanded he pull himself together. Once Tu Hyo cooled off, he returned to grill Hai Dao. Tu Hyo started probing into Hai Dao's family and kids. Catching the detective's drift, Hai Dao recalled the sheer savagery of Bin Duk's gang, and a profound terror gripped him. Paralyzed by the fear of gang retaliation against his family, it took Tu Hyo's ironclad promise of protection to finally break Hai Dao. He revealed Bin Duk's real name was Vuong Tuong. Hai Dao had previously served a 3-year stretch for tomb raiding. Post-release, he grafted on Bin Duk's building sites, only to be dragged back into the criminal underworld. Hai Dao possessed a highly specialized knack for blowing timber with explosives, a grueling technique taught solely by Bin Duk and known to virtually no one else. Still, Hai Dao was just a grunt. Bin Duk was the outfit's number 2. Acting as the mastermind strategist, Hai Dao disclosed that Jia Hak's crew had nicked the tortoise shell from the very ancient tomb Tran Nam was currently excavating. After surfacing from the tomb, Jia Hak seemingly lost his marbles. 6 months later, he butchered a female university student, hacking her to pieces. He murdered women because he was utterly consumed by the immortality ritual carved into the shell. Shortly after, the police clocked him. Jia Hak tried to bribe the lead detective but failed miserably. Tu Hyo instantly knew that detective was Kwok Kwong. Following the kidnapping of Kwok Kwong's daughter, Jia Hak realized he was a dead man walking, so he took the rap for everything, allowing Bin Duk and the others to slip the net. Yet, eager to teach Kwok Kwong a final, agonizing lesson, he slaughtered the girl anyway. Noticing Hai Dao sported a glass eye, Tu Hyo pressed him on it. The question flooded Hai Dao with remorse. After Jia Hak kicked the bucket, his son, Dai Da, took the reins. The crew wanted out of the deadly game to go legit, but they demanded Hai Dao keep diving into tombs. Moving forward, he was to handle all the filthy, backbreaking graft. Hai Dao wanted out too, thoroughly sick of the trade. To punish him for his defiance, Dai Da ruthlessly gouged out one of his eyes. Pressing on about the immortality ritual, Tu Hyo discovered each ceremony required the slaughter of 5 women. If it failed once, they had to repeat the butchery until it worked. A stunned silence fell over the station. These thugs were beyond barbaric. Driven by a deranged, superstitious thirst for eternal life, they had wiped out an untold number of innocent souls. Meanwhile, Tran Nam sought out a master forger to examine the bronze cauldron. Baffled as to why the genuine article was lighter than the knockoff, she asked the craftsman. He deduced the real cauldron likely featured a hollow double lining, using far less material, and thus making the ancient original significantly lighter than the solid fake. Tu Hyo visited the hospital, finding Kwok Kwong still comatose. He bumped into DM Nai, who had brought turtle soup for the ailing detective. She grumbled to Tu Hyo that Kwok Kwong had been perfectly fit, only to end up hospitalized for the sake of cracking a case. Tu Hyo could only smile awkwardly and listen, though seeing Kwok Kwong pampered by both Diem Ni and Din Dan made him realize the old man was, in fact, quite blessed. Tran Nam relentlessly scoured for cauldron clues, tearing through archives until she located relevant volumes in the library. Feigning a desire to connect with a fellow enthusiast, she pumped the librarian for the last person to check out the books. The librarian ran a search, revealing only one bloke had ever borrowed them, Tran Nam's very own mentor, Professor Han. Seeing this, Tran Nam's mind raced back to several highly dodgy quirks and actions her professor had displayed. That evening, whilst grafting late in the ancient tomb, she suddenly caught a noise. Tiptoeing to investigate, she was gobsmacked to find Professor Han creeping about. The following day, she used the double-line bronze theory as an excuse to pick Professor Han's brains. Curiously, he played incredibly dumb on the subject. Convinced he was faking, Tran Nam casually mentioned seeing him read up on it at the library to force the issue. Feigning utter shock, Professor Han firmly stated he hadn't set foot in a library for 2 solid years. Yet Tran Nam's rock-solid intel proved he had checked out those exact texts a mere 6 months ago. Back at the hospital, the doctor briefed Tu Hyo and Diem Ni. Kwok Kwong's coma was triggered by an explosive burst of rage. He strictly warned them to keep him utterly stress-free, lest he suffer a fatal brain hemorrhage. Frantic with worry, Diem Ni sharply told Tu Hyo off. Ordering him to tread carefully, Tu Hyo was forced to placate her with soothing reassurances. Tran Nam arrived to visit Kwok Kwong and swiftly updated Tu Hyo on the Cauldron saga. She also dropped the bombshell about Professor Han borrowing the restricted text texts. Right on cue, Kwok Kwong woke up. Though initially dismissive, Tu Hyo realized Tran Nam's clues were pure gold and started cross-examining her thoroughly. Awakening to the news that Hai Dao had spilled everything, Kwok Kwong knew Tu Hyo was now fully aware of his tragic past. He deliberately shooed Diem Ni and Din Dang out of the room before diving deep into the case with Tu Hyo and Tran Nam. Tu Hyo informed him that for the ritual to succeed, the cult needed to butcher 5 young women within a strict 100-day window. Din Dang was slated as the 5th victim, but her rescue meant the ritual had officially failed. Thus, Bin Duck was dead set on bagging a new target. Desperate to act, Kwok Kwong tried to discharge himself, but Tu Hyo pinned him down for the sake of his health. Yet the moment Tu Hyo left, Kwok Kwong geared up to resume the hunt. His prime suspect, Tran Nam's professor, chasing Tran Nam's lead, Kwok Kwong knocked on Trio Thien's door, an old acquaintance of the professor. However, spotting Tran Nam and Kwok Kwong, her face soured with absolute disdain. Trio Thien practically kicked Kwok Kwong off her doorstep, hauling only Tran Nam inside. Diem Ni returned with noodles to find Kwok Kwong's bed empty. Sparking a massive panic, she furiously rang him to give him a piece of her mind. Ultimately, she had no choice but to sort out his discharge papers. Meanwhile, Tran Nam continued relentlessly voicing her suspicions. Hearing his own pupil accuse him, Professor Han erupted in furious indignation. As a top-tier national expert, being lumped in with filthy Tomb Raiders was a gross, unforgivable insult. Unfazed, Tran Nam kept pressing him, pointing out his daily routine was bizarrely erratic. At that moment, Triu Tien stepped out and was forced to publicly confess her affair with Professor Han. Awkwardly caught in the crossfire, Tran Nam made a swift, highly uncomfortable exit. Back home, Kwok Kwong was meticulously pampered by Ding Dang, who rigorously checked his blood pressure every single day. Just then, Ding Dang's best mate, Tio Mu, rang to invite her out for a meal. Given Tio Mu's dodgy past line of work, Ding Dang feared Kwok Kwong would block it. She anxiously asked for his blessing, but he waved her off without a fuss. Whilst Tran Nam was working away, Professor Han suddenly barged in. He rounded everyone up, ruthlessly tearing into their dissertations one by one. Hearing the slaughter, Tran Nam was dead certain her paper was destined for the bin. She sat silently on the sidelines, hanging on to his every word. Out of nowhere, a barman dialed the police, claiming he'd spotted the wanted fugitive Bin Duck. Daifi scrambled a unit to the scene, only to discover the bloke wasn't Bin Duck at all. Over at Kwok Kwong's, Din Dang's late return from her meal with Tio Ngu sent him into a nervous spin. He hurriedly texted her to check she was alright. Concurrently, Tu Hyo, Daifi, and Tio Tin were still relentlessly digging into the case. They got a call from Ho Thien. Tran Nam had ended up in a massive brawl over a cat. Meanwhile, Bin Duck was prowling the streets in his motor, hunting for his next target. Din Dang and Tio Ngu finished their meal, said their goodbyes, and set off for their respective homes. Seeing Tio Ngu arrive safely downstairs, Kwok Kwong let his guard down. At that exact second, Bin Duck cruised past and locked his eyes on her. Kwok Kwong spotted Din Dang's silhouette but waited an eternity without her coming upstairs. Dashing down to fetch her, he found absolute nothingness. He only caught a glimpse of a van roaring away. His gut screamed that something catastrophic had happened. He wildly kicked his motorbike into gear and bolted after it. The van was driven by Bin Duck, who had knocked Din Dang out cold and snatched her, yet again. Glancing in his rearview mirror, Bin Duck spotted Kwok Kwong tailing him on a bike, yet didn't bat an eyelid. Just as the van neared the main road, Bin Duck slammed on the brakes. He flung the door open and violently ambushed Kwok Kwong, who was riding right behind him. Caught completely off guard, Kwok Kwong crashed to the tarmac, instantly knocked unconscious. Meanwhile, Tu Hyo was ferrying Tran Nam home, utterly lost for words. She was a PhD, for heaven's sake, yet here she was kicking off a scrap over a stray cat. Unapologetic, Tran Nam maintained she was in the right. A cat's life is still a life, and she refused to let it be savagely butchered for meat. Grateful for his bailout, she invited him in for a drink. Her flat was bursting with antiques. Tu Hyo dryly asked if she'd looted them from a tomb. She clarified they were mere high-quality replicas. They chatted as they had their drinks. Hearing Tu Hyo was actively hunting Bin Duck but had hit a brick wall, Tran Nam broke down the logistics. She explained that, per the ancient texts, this particular ritual was horrifically complex. The officiant required a pre-built altar. Since Bin Duck's mob worked in construction, they had almost certainly rigged one up already. Crucially, the altar had to be stationed in a spot overflowing with yang energy. Tran Nam wildly guessed that the undiscovered female body parts were stashed right there. Tu Hyo fell into a deep, brooding silence. Just then, Dai Fi rang in a panic. panic. Kwok Kwong had been violently attacked and was fighting for his life in hospital. Tu Hyo bolted out the door instantly. Tran Nam tried to tag along, but he ordered her to stay put, promising to keep her updated. Arriving at the hospital, Tu Hyo found Dai Fi and Teo Tin hovering over a still comatose Kwok Kwong. A night shift cab driver had discovered him bleeding on the road. Before blacking out again, Kwok Kwong had desperately gasped out the words "small van." Tu Hyo instantly mobilized a citywide manhunt, locking all focus strictly onto small vans. Over in a block of flats, Bin Duck steered his small van into an underground car park, lugging a massive suitcase out of the boot. He rode the lift straight up to a flat. Whilst busy with chores, Tran Nam suddenly heard a knock at the door. Opening it to an empty hallway, she was caught entirely off guard. The very next second, Bin Duck viciously snatched her away. Back at the station, the police frantically reviewed the CCTV footage. Tu Hyo spotted Bin Duck's van rolling into Tran Nam's apartment complex. It had happened a full 40 minutes ago. Dreading the worst, Tu Hyo rang her repeatedly, but got no answer. A terrifying gut feeling hit him. He scrambled a heavily armed unit and rushed to her flat. The front door was wide open. She was nowhere to be seen. Her mobile was left sitting on the table. Tu Hyo knew instantly she was in grave danger. He barked orders to erect roadblocks at every major junction to trap the van. Reviewing the street cameras, they saw the van vanish at a T-junction. Being a desolate stretch, it was entirely devoid of CCTV. Recalling Tran Nam's earlier theory, Tu Hyo split his squad into 3 teams to scour the route. Their target, densely packed, bustling locations, saturated with yang energy. Tran Nam woke up with a violent jolt, realizing she was bundled inside the boot of a car. Her wrists and ankles were bound tight. Beside her lay Din Dang. Tran Nam furiously kicked Din Dang awake. Terrified of tipping Bin Duck off, the pair spoke in frantic, hushed whispers. Din Dang signaled she had a small pocket knife stashed in her coat. Tran Nam shimmied over and agonizingly managed to extract the blade with her tied hands. Working seamlessly together, the two women completely cut through their bonds. At that moment, Bin Duck veered the van into a desolate wasteland. It was once a timber processing plant attached to a coal mine. When mining operations scaled back, the yard was utterly abandoned. As Bin Duck opened the boot, Tran Nam and Din Dang sprang into action. They brutally threw a heavy plastic tarp over his head. Seizing the chaotic window, they bolted for their lives out of the yard. To split his focus, the two women scrambled in completely opposite directions. Despite his massive bulk, Bin Duck was a trained martial artist, moving with terrifying speed. Ripping the tarp off, he expertly navigated the familiar terrain to ruthlessly hunt them down. Even though Din Dang held her breath, Bin Duck spotted her first. He clamped a chloroform-soaked rag viciously over her mouth. After she fell unconscious, Bin Duck slung her over his shoulder and hauled her back. Though Tran Nam had safely escaped, she realized Din Dang had been snatched again. Without hesitation, Tran Nam boldly resolved to turn back and save her. Marching right out into Bin Duck's path, she caught him entirely off guard. Sticking her hands out, she boldly declared his grand ritual absolutely demanded a witness. Bin Duck tied her up once more and dragged her down into the cellar. It was an endlessly long subterranean tunnel. Tran Nam was marched right to its bleak end. She saw the cult had rigged the space into a horrifyingly macabre altar. It was completely cocooned in a giant silkworm-like web. Right in the center stood a colossal cauldron. A roaring fire blazed underneath it. Eerie candles cast a terrifying glow all around the room. Meanwhile, Tu Hyo and his squad finally received a solid tip-off. They rapidly descended on the timber plant. At that exact moment, Bin Duck hauled Din Dang onto the altar. He rummaged through his tools, withdrawing a razor-sharp blade. Then he violently ripped the clothes from her back. Tran Nam screamed at the top of her lungs, desperately trying to stop him. But Bin Duck completely ignored her. He located the half-carved character for life etched into Din Dang's flesh. Just as he prepared to strike his final blow, Tu Hyo burst onto the scene in the nick of time. He launched himself forward, brutally kicking the savage culprit aside. Bin Duck fought back with absolute suicidal fury. He violently clashed with Tu Hyo in a savage brawl. Whilst the two men were locked in a deadly struggle, Tran Nam furiously worked herself free. She sprinted over to pull Din Dang from the altar. Right then, Dai Fi's heavily armed squad flooded the room. Bin Duck was swiftly handcuffed and marched out. Tu Hyo knew Tran Nam had tipped the police off, but he couldn't fathom why she'd turned back after securing her own escape. She explained she did it purely to stall for time until the police arrived. Tu Hyo silently marveled at her astonishing bravery, yet he kept his mouth firmly shut. He simply patted her shoulder, praising her brilliant work. Bin Duck's interrogation interrogation commenced. He didn't put up the slightest resistance. He confessed absolutely everything. Tu Hyo and the team wanted to know. Bin Duk knew his days were severely numbered. Thus he treated the interrogation as his final sermon. He desperately hoped someone would grasp the immortality secret and carry on his legacy. Hearing this, Tu Hyo and Dai Fi were simultaneously amused and violently incensed. They were utterly gobsmacked that, even at the bitter end, he remained so hopelessly deluded. Tu Hyo brutally informed Bin Duk that immortality was nothing but a massive con. The swindler was none other than Lu Shuyan. He was the architect who had entirely fabricated the immortality ritual and forged the cauldron. Lu Shuyan hadn't merely conned 4 generations of the Chu clan, he had successfully swindled people living thousands of years after his death. These thugs had slaughtered a mountain of innocent people and savagely hacked their victims to pieces, all for a completely fabricated trick. Bin Duk instantly shrieked that this was blatant blasphemy against the gods. He even spat out the twisted logic that if those murdered women had lived, they would have only been a massive headache for the police anyway. Utterly sick of this criminal's drivel, Tu Hyo cut the interrogation short. He demanded to know why Bin Duk had specifically targeted Dindang. Bin Duk coldly replied that once she was marked, she was absolutely destined to be a sacrifice. With that, Bin Duk was hauled away. Tu Hyo remarked to Dai Fi that these people would stoop to any depravity to fuel their desires, and it was the sole duty of the police to hold the moral line of society. The following day, Tran Nam returned to her work at the dig site. Professor Han beckoned her over. Tran Nam assumed he was about to speak about her dissertation. Knowing she had crossed him, she fully expected to have to rewrite the whole paper. Instead, Professor Han calmly announced that her dissertation had been approved. He had spoken to his children about his affair with Trio Tian, and they had forgiven him. For years, he had been obsessively wedded to his work, making an absolute shambles of his personal life. Consequently, he had submitted a formal request for an extended leave of absence. During his sabbatical, Tran Nam was to take charge of the research lab. Overjoyed and deeply respectful, she stood up and offered him a profoundly deep bow. Meanwhile, Tu Hyo dropped by the hospital to check on Kwok Kwong, only to find him in Dindang's ward. Walking in, he saw Diem Ni feeding Dindang. Kwok Kwong sat right beside them, gazing at Dindang with a gentle expression. Bin Duk had confessed. The grotesque dismemberment case was successfully closed. Chief Duong generously granted the task force a half-day off. Everyone was still absolutely buzzing. Tu Hyo immediately offered to treat the whole team to a meal. Kwok Kwong was similarly overjoyed. He took another stroll down to the children's palace, stopping in front of the wax crayon portrait his daughter had drawn. A deeply contented smile spread across his face. Dindang had since picked up a job at a small eatery. Diem Ni and Kwok Kwong popped in during the lunch rush. Eating the diner's pastries, they proudly watched her bustle about. Tu Hyo treated his squad to a pizza feast. The whole crew wanted him to invite Tran Nam too. Even though she wasn't officially part of the task force, she had played a massive role in cracking the case. Tu Hyo gave Tran Nam a ring. She was busy packing her bags, preparing to fly out to Italy for a cultural heritage restoration gig. Tu Hyo sternly warned her to be careful, reminding her the gangs over there were notoriously savage. Tran Nam cheekily fired back. "And what if I don't make it back?" Tu Hyo hastily told her to stop talking. Such rubbish. Back at the station, Dai Fi and Tio Tin were organizing the files and evidence from the dismemberment case. They nagged Kwok Kwong to stop spending all day in the archives, telling him he needed to get out, catch some sun, and breathe in some fresh air. With the case solved, Kwok Kwong was thoroughly relaxed. Even the flowers seemed to smell sweeter than usual. Whilst everyone was out eating, Tu Hyo stayed behind to review the files. Spotting a particular scroll, he unrolled it. He remembered Tran Nam saying this was the Lu Tian Do painting. The man depicted was named Lu Shuyan. He was the Grand High Priest of the Chu dynasty. He was exclusively responsible for overseeing and orchestrating the sacrificial rituals. That being the case, Bin Duk and his gang were clearly unqualified to execute this. Was it possible there was yet another mastermind pulling the strings behind the immortality ritual? As this thought crossed his mind, Tu Hyo's expression turned incredibly serious. He knew everything hadn't stopped here. The film ends here. Catch you all in the next videos. Goodbye.